Welcome. This is the Drupal Usability for September 8th, 2023. I'm Benji Fisher, moderating, and also present are Ralph Kohler, who's sharing his screen, and we'll start off the discussion. Aaron McHale, Emma Harrell, and Simo Helston. Go ahead, Ralph.
Okay, in the beginning, we'll take a look at issue number 24085549. I've tested it yesterday and applied the patch, the current state, and we've discussed the issue as well at the Drupal Dojo Austin yesterday night. And let's quickly jump over. For the context, I've added the following line to the settings PHP file, just renamed the name from Drupal to Drupalwrite. And if I go now to System, Basic Site Settings, then I get the following. Oops. Is it legible that way?
Yes, we can see that easily.
Okay. We get the warning message. This form contains values that have been overwritten. Changes to these values can still be saved, but the overwritten values will take precedence. Overrides are as follows. In the config file system.site, the value for name has been overwritten. Drupal has been changed to Drupalwrite. And the cognitive load is rather high to process that warning message from my point of view. At first, rather long text, then something like system.site as a site builder or someone with less technical expertise getting such a warning message. I wonder where is system site on that page, then name is also
Okay, before we go into the discussion of how to improve this, let's make sure everyone is up to date. So the snippet you showed us in your settings.php is the standard way for overriding configuration. And can you go to the home page? And I think it'll show the override.
It's already showing in the tabs title, as you see there, Drupalwrite. And if you go back to the site, also there.
Right. So the admin config has the standard, what is it, Drupal? But
yeah.
Site name Drupal, but that's been overridden to Drupalwrite. All of that is standard. What's the patch from this issue is just adding this warning message to let you know that whatever you enter in the site name field is not going to have any effect. Any questions about that? I have an assistant here who's been helping me type. Four-legged and furry. Any questions? And the issue is about having some mechanism to alert people when there are overrides in effect. Okay, so the current patch adds this warning message, and yeah, I think it's technically inaccurate to talk about the config file, and not very helpful. I think we could just strike that line.
Yeah, that for example, yeah.
And then probably we should start with the following configuration is overridden, and then the bulleted list, and then have the message at the bottom. That would be an improvement, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but I think in my opinion, it would be so much better if we could show this information in the close to the actual fields, because with the control doing this, I was 3 weeks ago, I was updating this university site that had something like, it had a complex node form with something like 20 or 30, I think, overrides, and it was just one. The warning message couldn't fit on the screen, and then trying to figure out, okay, so what is what, and not using the correct, or not using the labels. Also, so it's kind of a one thing would be for sure to use the label that's shown on the screen, but also it would be very much helpful if there is maybe 10, 12, 20 overrides on, I think at least can happen on a node form. Then, yeah, in that case, it would be it's very, very, very helpful to have those close to the actual fields. So it's kind of a little bit different for simple forms, but with complex forms, it's not at all usable if the warning message takes up more than one full screen.
Wow.
So
You must have a lot of overrides.
Yeah, it's kind of a. I probably started as Drupal 8, and now we just upgraded to Drupal 10, and it's been kind of a very complex integrations to all kind of university systems. So it's kind of this course database, national databases and stuff like that. So it's quite complex. But yeah,
Okay.
So it's actually a real use case I just encountered like 3 weeks ago.
Great. Ralph, go ahead.
I just want to add to Simo's point. That's something that was also voiced yesterday in Austin, to have some sort of icon inline in front of the fields that are affected and are overridden. But the suggestion yesterday went one step further, because there were two different point of views. One example was basically someone who wants to see the active, being able to see and edit the active config. Rocketeer BKV made the example, for example, for his personal site. His site in production is called My Site, for example, and then he has an override for basically development, so that he's able to see a different context. And if you show, for example, the override there in the site, then you would have to end the override, then change it. But that, in the current way, it would be possible if you have the icon, you see what's the override if you hover, for example, and then you're still able to change it in the config, but it's overwritten basically. But then if you deactivate or remove, basically in the settings PHP file, that override, then you can seamlessly switch over. And Eclipse GC, I guess is its username, had the different point of view and need. I guess it was end variables he had as example, and he wants to see what's the actual override in the form. And that way, the suggestion yesterday was to reduce the length of the warning, just to say on that form there are overrides, and provide some sort of a switch statement. Then use the icons in line for the fields that are altered and overwritten. And per default, you show the active config like currently. And if you switch, then you are able to see directly the overwritten values. That was the suggestion. And as a follow-up idea that is also voiced in the issue in number 44 and 46 to add some sort of reports page to have a whole list of all overrides of the whole site. That would be also an additional idea that was voiced.
Your audio is very choppy.
Oh, maybe I'm too far away from the.
Much better.
Yeah. So yeah, I was kind of thinking of suggesting to have this kind of a overview page to see all the overrides, especially since we can. Actually, it might be useful if we can get the file name, which file has been, or kind of, because we can have like a lot of different settings.php, so it would be useful to know which file is being read for the override. But yeah, but I was also thinking that it's kind of a complex to have a kind of a switching which to show, but so it can be quite confusing for a lot of people. But to have maybe like adding before that like that before the storage, like before the other description, we could have there, like in the description area, information about the override. So it would be smaller text, but it could be kind of, if we could use that, it would be something that some people maybe look at. And I've seen that done as kind of a manual thing, that on forms where you can edit descriptions, people have added notes there that this has been overridden in this and that. So it's something that wouldn't be a totally new idea to have it mentioned in the description.
Okay. Ralph, could I share my screen for a minute?
Yeah, 1 second. Yeah. Oh, and I have to lower my
you.
hand.
Because there are several contributed modules that address this issue. I think you see my screen now.
Yes.
So here's one, config override warn, and that's the one that was mentioned in one of the comments on the issue we've been looking at. And this has over 2,000 sites reporting using it. And let's just have a quick look at this screenshot. So this looks like pretty much the same as the patch we've been looking at. There are others, config override inspector, which has fewer modules reported using it. Let's again have a quick look at its screenshots. Is that all the same screenshot? Changes you make here will not take effect due to environment-specific configuration. Again, that's adding some sort of message. Let's just so yeah, this seems to be adding a message to the individual form elements. And has a bunch of options for how to display it. That's the screenshot we already looked at. Here's another one. Only has 2 sites reporting that they're using it. Just a minute, Aaron. And config notify, a few hundred sites. And this seems to have some sort of Oh, just a simple warning message at the top without any details. So go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks. So I was kind of thinking of this in the background. I think so. We're seeing the warning message pattern being used a lot, but I think the risk with that is if users just see that all the time on the same form, they're gonna kind of start to ignore it basically when it appears. And what we don't want is to get in a situation where users are ignoring warning or error messages. So I would recommend that the implementation in core uses something more like just an info message, because we really should be using errors and warnings for something where we need to, you need to take an action. And in this case, this is just providing information. It's not saying you're taking an action. So the kinds of these messages there's not anything meaningful for the user to do. And so if they're just staying there on the same form for a long time, then users are going to start, cognitively ignoring those warning things that look like warning messages, is my concern. And I would agree with the idea that we should be associating each one with the field itself. So like some kind of maybe like an info message next to the at the fields as well that are being overridden. And it would be nice to have some, and maybe this is a follow-up, but something to indicate so you can easily see what the actual value that is going to be shown or you would see like on the front end what the overridden value is versus what the value saved in configuration. And yeah, I would still be I think I would still like to see what specific, like, maybe what the name of the configuration excuse me, what the configuration object name is or something like that. So like in this case, we can see system.settings, but I also agree that like talking about configuration file is not necessarily the most appropriate terminology there. So that's my thoughts.
Okay, so there are a few questions to consider here. First of all, should this be done in core at all, or should we continue to work on this in contrib? And as I pointed out, there are several contrib modules that already do it. Two, I think Aaron has a good point. This shouldn't be a warning message. It should be an info message. And if we are going to talk about the current patch, we can certainly make some recommendations for improving that. And three, should it be a single warning message at the top of the page, or should there be indications on each overridden field? And yeah, maybe the simplest thing to do at this point is the second option and discuss ways for improving the current patch. Although I'd sort of like to spend at least a couple of minutes talking about the question of whether this should be done in core or not.
Yeah, I think it should be in core because it's something that kind of helps to prevent mistakes, site builder mistakes, or kind of a site builder trying to do something and not being able to achieve it using the interface that is designed for doing it. So it's something like I think it's very relevant if somebody ends up as a site in a site builder role in a site where they are not familiar with all the configuration overrides. So I think it's yeah, it's something that would be useful in core. It would prevent frustration.
Okay, and you got a thumbs up from Ralph on that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think it makes sense in core because in core we support the ability to override configuration. Therefore, we should be telling you in core when the configuration is overridden, because right now there just simply isn't any indication. And there's also a situation where you might have overridden a piece of configuration in the settings file like years ago and completely forgot you've done it, right? And you go to try and change something, and right now in core, as kind of as Simo was saying, it's like, well, if I go change that, but it doesn't have any effect on what I'm doing, like you might get frustrated or confused as to why. Maybe you think it's a bug, so yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to do in core.
Okay, and in the chat, Emma agrees it should be in core. And Ralph agrees with your point. Sometimes 6 months is enough to forget about something. It doesn't have to be years. Okay. So yeah, let's proceed. This should be in core. And shall we talk about improving this message? I think one, as Aaron said, it should be info, not warning. Two, I don't think it is at all helpful to talk about it's actually a config object system.site. It's not a config file. The file would be system.site.yaml. And if you're not using config management, you might not have such a file. But anyway, I don't think it should be there at all. Third, I think that we should list the overrides first and then have those 2 long sentences. As Ralph says, they're hard to scan. We should move those to the bottom. And then fourth, addressing the point that Simo raised earlier, there are cases where there are many, many, many overrides. We should put them in a details element, collapsed initially, so that the message takes up less room unless you expand it. Care to discuss any of those 4 points? I'll put something in the chat to summarize.
Sorry, you're saying so not having the message, like a message on each field, and keeping it all in a single like detail element?
For now, I'm just discussing the current implementation. And I think we should consider an indication on each field as well.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just start with the patch we've got and talk about improving its usability.
Yeah, I think like I'm not saying we shouldn't have a summary. I think like a summary at the top of the form could be quite helpful. And if we also did that, I'd agree with your note of, put a detail element.
I think having that system.site or whatever it was called, those kind of information there, maybe it's for someone it's helpful for finding like when you go to the edit the override, so then it might be helpful, but maybe it's not the most useful thing to have there all the time, especially if there are several overrides. So yeah. But in some cases, it might be useful to have it if there could be an overview page. So maybe that could include some information about more information about where the overrides are.
I'm sorry, I was typing into the chat, and I think I changed the numbering, but the 4 points I made are there. And I'm sorry, Simo, you were suggesting adding an overview page as well as the warning message on the individual set config pages?
Yeah, like overview page could have more of those technical details, so that maybe it's a slightly different, like might be different users looking at the overview and different users looking at the forms. So it would give us option to kind of take a more kind of a not so necessary information from that message and just use the overview page to provide a way to access them from the graphic user interface.
So how much information are you thinking of moving to some sort of overview page? Because of course we also don't want to, you know, make people have an extra click to find information. So there's a trade-off between that and having a message that's too long. So are you thinking of these first two sentences, moving that to a separate page?
And that I think that config file thing, which is not a file, but was it object or something like that? So that kind of so in a way to on the form to pass information about what has been overridden, and then there would be kind of another step to find out where it has been overridden written. So in a way, separating it like that.
Okay.
It might be a complex, and it actually, if we're just talking about this patch, then it's kind of a little bit out of scope. It would be another issue.
Right.
Adding.
Perhaps a follow-up. Emma, go ahead.
I think Ralph might have been before me, but I can go because it is related to Simo's point. I was like at the config file information. I know you said it's incorrect for this instance, but I'm not clear. Is that the value, the bullet point message at the bottom? Would somebody know where, for example, that value for name is, or is the config file piece of information helping them to locate where the override is?
That's a good question. And no, the override is done in settings.php, and telling them which config object is involved does not help them find that.
Okay, thank you.
Ralph?
One question and two suggestions. Is it possible that on a single form there's more than one config object, meaning that on one page you have systems.site and, for example, something else? Because if it's possible that there are two different config objects in one form, then removing the line in the config file system.site would be difficult, because then the context for the overwritten values would be missing.
I believe it's possible. It's certainly unusual, but I believe it's possible to have more than one config object managed by a single form.
Okay. Then
so that's just another argument for removing this line entirely, right?
no, the other way around. Because if you have two config objects on the page and you remove that line and you have just name and the next value, call it the variable x, and y is in a different config object, then you have a hard time finding it, directly finding it at least.
Oh, and Thomas Howell has just joined us.
And just the two suggestions. I like the idea of focusing, honing the current catch, and I would move the inline icon to a separate follow-up issue as a suggestion for that, as well as the reports page, the dedicated one, also in a follow-up issue, and maybe to that info message add a link to that status page, reports page maybe, would be also an idea.
Okay, for the sake of Thomas, who just joined us, we're discussing configuration overrides, and there's an issue that adds this warning message. I added an override to settings.php to override this value, and this warning message is informing me of that. And go ahead, Aaron.
I'd agree with what Benji said. I just don't think talking about the config object is relevant, because like in all forms, when you interact with a form in Drupal, we don't tell you what that config is, where it's stored, right? You fill in the form, you save it, and that's it. You don't know that information. What we're talking about here is overriding the config, and the way you overwrite that, and if you want to remove the override, has nothing to do with, well, when you want to remove it or change it, it doesn't actually have anything to do with the config object. It's insofar as you go into the settings.php file or use another module to change the override. So we could actually be misleading people by talking about the config object here, because they might then assume, oh, if I go into like the configuration settings, like in under development configuration, that somehow there I can change what this override is, when in actual fact, that would have no bearing on the override value. Yeah.
Actually, Simo said something in the chat, and I'll simply use this little text box to paste in the actual override that I added to my settings.php. And the point is that the system.site does appear here. So there is some use in telling me that system.site is the relevant config object. It's one way to search for it in settings.php. On the other hand, it's also pretty easy to search for the override value in settings.php. So it has some relevance. I still don't think it's needed. But go ahead, Aaron.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that exact thing actually. Like if you want to change this, like you can search for that value perfectly fine, and you would know in theory, like you could know the name of the field. But because I think like if there was other situations where I think there's a lot of other situations where it'd be more helpful to know what the config object is. Like simply maybe that was an option you could turn on, like a debug option or something to show on the form. But I since we don't do that in core, I'm not inclined to suggest that this issue should be introducing it. Maybe that's a follow-up issue, but yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Thomas.
So what is the specific audience for this message?
I'd say it's site builders who are doing changes to sites that were kind of passed down to them, like maybe a couple of generations. So I think it's a site builder.
So it's
builder or administrator. It might have been built and now I'm the administrator maintaining it.
And this message shows up only here on this page or on the page that's impacted, or where does it appear?
Any configuration form where some of the configuration is overridden.
Okay, so there's the use case then, you're like just to restate what was said, is that it's a site builder, administrator level person with, I assume, back-end access, because you're only going to care about this if you have access to the actual code base, correct?
Not necessarily. The point is to prevent the frustration of, oh, I want to change the site name. It seems to be Druvaride, and oh wait, it's already what I intended it to be, and I'm going to save this page, and that should fix it. And then interesting. Oh, I wonder if that's what caused the problem. But anyway, it's to prevent the frustration of not seeing your changes take effect, whether or not you have permission or access to change the override.
Got it.
Let me just read in the meeting chat. Simo points out that you can search not just a single file, but all your files to find system.site. And I would point out you could do the same thing to search for the value as well as the system.site. Any other questions, Thomas?
No, I mean, I think that answers it. I think that in either instance, this assumes a level of knowledge on the part of the admin or site builder that may not be there. So you're giving them a message, but not. So we're saying they could search these files, but they may not know that they should be searching files. Like they may be continuing to look through the web-based UI, in which case they wouldn't know to look for a file in the file system.
Yeah, so maybe we should give a link to the appropriate documentation page. I don't know offhand what that is, but I'm sure there is a documentation page for config overrides.
That would be helpful, or saying, again, if we wanted to search for, but again, making certain that it's documented somewhere how to resolve this warning message, because I could see someone inheriting a site who is not an experienced Drupalist going insane, both from the behavior and from the warning message, because they wouldn't know where to go.
Okay, Ralph, what did you want to say?
Just added a link. Just wanted to add a +1 and say that a link to the docs in the info message was also voiced yesterday, and it would be a good idea to have something to provide some guidance.
Okay.
Not sure if it's the correct one, but if there's a better docs page, but there is some one we found yesterday in that context.
Yeah, I think this is the right page to use. And Aaron?
Yeah, I think there's a slight difficulty with like trying to give what am I trying to say? Basically, you can override configuration settings.php, but that's not the only way configuration could be overridden. For instance, there's a module that I'm working with that overrides configuration itself, based on values that come in from, I'm gonna say it's the key module or something. It's like you can store like say the value of like for, okay, so the example is like we have a module that does like SMTP. I think it's just the SMTP module, and you can store the username and password in configuration module, but we can use the key module to then override those values because we're pulling them from somewhere else. Like so, it's not even, in some cases it's not even like the settings.php file, and in some cases like that might be a contrib module that's doing it, and we would have no idea in core necessarily, unless there's a way to tell in core like what's providing that override. It's really difficult to definitively say to like a site builder like, okay, you can go here to change that value. So I think like linking to documentation is probably the safest thing, but we'd have to make sure it's the right documentation, because that one is API documentation and might not be suitable for, at least I think it's in the configuration API. So that might not have all of the context. I don't know, I haven't read it, but I'm just mindful that we're working an example right now where it might not be the settings file that provides that override. So yeah, it's a tricky one for sure.
It does talk about providing overrides for modules on this page.
Ah, okay, that's good.
Thomas?
Just a small comment. I could see what Aaron's mentioning being problematic for site builders, in that they may not know the difference. So I think that link to the documentation is all that we need, but let's make certain the documentation makes sense to someone who is not necessarily a first generation builder, someone who built the site. So I would do I would recommend some form of usability testing on this, because um, this is a pretty tricky thing that could impact people. And I'm positive that I've seen issues when I worked in support, where a lot of time was spent tracking down why a particular behavior was occurring in this way. And so I think the documentation is probably great today, but let's make certain that what Aaron's talking about, like that we are addressing that, so that when they get to the documentation and they get to that section and they see the options, that they comprehend what those options mean.
Okay, and we're getting a thumbs up from Aaron. So let's try to come up with some specific recommendations. We have 10 or 15 minutes left. And let's see, where can I get a nice little text area to type into? Maybe I'll just open a Google Doc. So can we get go through these quickly and see whether we agree on these recommendations? First one, it should be an info message, not a warning message. Agree, disagree? I see a thumbs up from Ralph and Aaron and Simo and Thomas. Okay, everyone agrees to that. Do you agree to moving the long sentences to the bottom? So let's see. And what I mean by that is taking these two sentences at the top and moving them to the bottom. Do you agree to that change? Thumbs up from Ralph and Emma and Thomas. Aaron, go ahead.
I would be inclined to take the first sentence, or maybe we want to reword it slightly, but essentially keep the first sentence at the top, because we're stating the form as overrides. Then we're explaining the overrides. And then finally, we could say changes to these values can still be saved, but the override value would take precedent. So I'd be inclined to, yeah, do that. Maybe. I think maybe works slightly better, just because that feels more like an introduction, and then, go into it.
In fact, if we do that, then we can strike this, can't we?
Yeah, probably.
Ralph gives a thumbs up to that. Okay. So just one long sentence at the bottom. Okay, I think everyone agrees to that. Great, thanks. List overrides in a collapsed detail element. Again, Simo mentioned a case he saw a few weeks ago where there were so many overrides that the message took more than a page. Go ahead, Ralph.
It makes sense to make a constraint that they have to at least 2 overrides or 3 maybe to wrap it in a detail element. Otherwise, just display it as is.
Getting back to what Aaron was saying about alarm fatigue or In other words, the tendency to ignore messages that you see all the time. I would like to keep it as short as possible, and probably something like this initial line would be the would be the label for the details element, and that's all you would see. And then when you expand it, you would see the list. I prefer as short as possible, even if there are only one or two or three. I'm getting a thumbs up from Aaron, so I guess he agrees with me.
Okay.
Have I convinced you, Ralph?
Yep.
Would you also put the final sentence in the detail element?
I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's hard to know until you actually see it, but maybe we could leave that as a just sort of like open-ended, see what looks best kind of thing. I mean, I could go either way, to be honest.
Okay, something to consider. And let's see, in this document I'm working with, I've already removed the line about the config item, and I guess that we had some discussion about that. So,
does Google Docs has like a quote format, doesn't it? Maybe that would be good, the way to illustrate being in the detail element. Like if you took all that text and just, I think it has a quote format type. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Just a minute. So this was actually, there we go. So if I say select all of that, and where do I find formatting?
Maybe it was in the normal text dropdown, because like is that the out of the format menu on the toolbar, where it says on the toolbar where it says normal text.
How do I close this menu? There we go.
Might be in there somewhere.
I don't think so. Yeah. Too hard. Okay. So this line, we could keep it, we could put it inside the details element. We could remove it entirely. Opinions? Go ahead, Thomas.
I hadn't considered earlier what it looks like with a page worth of overrides. What changes to the config file system site line? Like, are all of the config files, or are these things nested? Like, what would it actually look like in that instance? Like, if there are 3 changes to system.site and 4 changes to another config file, does it group them? What does that appear?
Simo, can you answer that? I'm not sure how it would work. And as I said, it's very unusual to have more than one config object handled by a single form.
Yeah, so this was kind of this node form with a lot of different, like a very long node form. And thinking, yeah, I don't actually recall. It was using the contrib module version that's similar to this patch. And actually, I don't think I can access it without switching some VPNs and stuff like that.
Okay. So the answer is we don't know.
I'm thinking like I feel like that's like a 5% use case, maybe less, because basically for any entity, it's going to be in one object because the entity forms are just constructed to only work with one object at a time, I believe. That may be like things like inline entity break that paradigm, but let's not go there. And then the simple configuration, I think it's super unlikely. Like I really think it's unlikely. But I also come back to the point, this information either doesn't help or potentially sends someone down the wrong track because that isn't where you go to edit it. You go to the contrib module or the settings file.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I vote for just removing that line, as point 4 says. Getting a thumbs up from Thomas. Aaron was just agreeing with that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense given what you described earlier.
Okay, so we'll just remove it. And last point, adding a link to the documentation. I think we all agree on that.
Though I would add confirm that documentation works for this use case. Like test it.
And is that like a in the detail, out the detail kind of thing? Do we settle on where that link would go?
All right, we are running up against a time limit. So I can copy this and put it into the Slack thread. And do we have a volunteer to comment on the issue?
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking about one more thing to change because that value for name, it's not using the, like in this case, it's not using the same text it's using on the field as label. So it might be also extra confusing trying to find where this value name is because it has because what seeing user sees is the label.
That is, I think, unarguable. We could use the label. Same thing they see on the form.
Yep. Also, it might be something that somebody kind of didn't take into account also that the label can be overridden and stuff like that as well. But it's not our problem. The same
And translated.
Yeah.
Might not even be in that language.
Okay, so we just need a volunteer to post a comment on the issue. I suppose I can do it, but I already have a bunch of to-dos. Aaron, you're volunteering?
Well, I'm also just something that came to mind is that the messaging brush site install has been changed to Droveride. Droveride is maybe kind of misleading in itself because it's not that like in this context it's not been changed. It's just that we're telling you that when you see it somewhere else, it's not going to be, it's going to be the overridden value. So we're out of time here, of course, but maybe we need to put more thought into that part of the text as well. It's yeah, I just think it could be that could also be confusing.
Okay, Emma has to drop and we are a little bit over.
Benji, when you post this, I just don't know what the issue is, but I can get it from the video. So when you save the video and send that out, I'll then post this afterwards for you.
Okay, I can put a link into the Slack channel as well.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for volunteering to leave a comment. Great. That's it for this week. Do it again next week. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, Benji. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Have a nice
Bye.
weekend.